I was ordained 33 years ago, which is hard for me to believe. And ordained means that it's a religious thing where a bishop puts his hand on your head and you become a pastor after all your education and everything you do. And so after I was ordained, I couldn't wait for my first church because I grew up in a church just like this church, filled with excitement and new people and kids everywhere. And you never knew at my home church when something crazy would happen. A guy dressed up like Martin Luther might walk down the aisle on Reformation Sunday. The Guilford High School varsity football team would be part of the junior sermon. The music was awesome. The sermons were inspired. And the church always gave. The church was surrounded on this hill by farmland. And so they rented acres all around the church to grow fresh food for the hungry in Rockford. And we collected food and clothes and worked at shelters and soup kitchens as families, like we all did it. And the church was filled with all sorts of different people, CEOs and teachers and dentists and doctors and carpenters and salespeople, blue collar, white collar. And everybody was so different. But they had one thing in common. They loved God, and they followed the way of Jesus, and they loved their church. And they wanted to live real faith for real life. And everything wasn't perfect. As a church, we faced tragedies and cancer and loss just like everybody else, every other church did. Children and fathers and mothers died. People faced terminal illnesses. But we were taught in that church a real faith for a real life. Not Pollyanna faith, not pie-in-the-sky faith. Not faith that only works when things are great. We were taught faith in the face of pain and struggle. Faith that could move in you and around you and when life seemed so dark. Faith that surrounded you with love until you could walk again on your own. Resurrection faith is what I call it. That saw miracles and blessings in the darkest, most unusual places that would give you hope when you feel hopeless. That's the way I grew up. And I believe that every single church in the entire world was just like my church. But my first church as a pastor, when I was ordained, was nothing like the church I grew up in. It had potential. The people were sweet and they were loving. But everything in the church was about the past, about who they used to be and who their pastor used to be. He was famous, and they lived in the past and told stories of the glory days when everything was great and when they were growing and when they were number one. Yet they wanted everyone and everything to stay the same. And there hadn't been new stories or new success in this church for years and years and years. So if you know me, you can imagine when I showed up at this church with all my crazy ideas of what church is. That I think church is vibrant and unpredictable and real faith for real life. And so every time we were going to do something, I would say, here, I got this idea for you, and everybody would roll their eyes. In 2 months, I wore this church out, wore them out with all my ideas. The church was located in the southeast side of Rockford in this very poor blue-collar community. It's not, I've never been in that place. And so I felt that it was important to reach out into the community. And so I would walk down the street. It was on 6th Street, and then Broadway was right around. So I would walk down the street and just talk to people with my collar on. And I would walk past massage parlors, and I would walk past prostitutes, and I invited them to come to church. Seems crazy. I would go 2 days a week and play pool in a dive bar where bikers were with my collar on. And I invited people to come to church. It's crazy. And I collected hundreds of costumes from all over, and the people in my home church, which was across town, and I set up a costume shop for the kids in the neighborhood who couldn't afford Halloween costumes. And hundreds of kids came and got a costume for the first time in their life. And in all those places, we talk about Jesus and real faith for real life, and we talked about their struggles and their pain and their addiction and their abortions and their fear of church people and their mistrust of the church. And I said, but you don't know my church. And so I invited them to my church. And just so you know, I was way out of my comfort zone with all of this. Up until I was at this church, I had never met a prostitute, ever. My wife is always happy when I say that I've never met a prostitute. Until that time, until this church. Until this church, I had never been in a biker bar where there was a knife fight. Until this church, I had never bumped into a parishioner coming out of a massage parlor. Until this church, and it was awkward. But this was the neighborhood we were in. These are the people that we had to love. And I was sure that this church would become an amazing place filled with faith and excitement. Not this church. It was weird. So many of the people on the street I invited to come to our church for the very first time were excited to come to church. They were excited to come to the church I told them about until they actually came to church. The prostitutes I invited were told after church to never come back. The bikers who came were told next time they better dress up and cover their tattoos. As the offering plates went around, the ushers would hold the plate in front of some poor blue-collar working family and just stand there until they gave something, and they would roll their eyes when it would be just a few coins or $1. In 18 months, more new people and new families came into that church than the previous 10 years, and none of them were welcomed, and none of them stayed. And when I'd see these people on the streets, they would ask me why I lied to them. Why did I tell them stories about a place that's filled with love and grace? A place that was dynamic and exciting, that would welcome people like them. And I couldn't explain. How do you explain that two churches that follow Jesus, the same Jesus, are so very different? And so I decided to leave after 18 months. It wasn't even 2 years, because I realized this church was poison to my soul. And I needed to look for people who love God and follow Jesus and were looking for real faith, for real life in the good and the bad. In the gospel this morning, it's interesting. It says that Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, and a huge crowd had followed him because they had seen him do miraculous things. And he didn't do the miraculous things in the temple, and he didn't do them in the synagogue, but he did them out in the world. Real faith, real life. And it's getting late, and the people need to eat, and so he asks Philip, and he knows the answer to this, but he wants to see if Philip knows the answer. He says, where are all these people going to get food? Now remember, Jesus has just been driving out demons, healing the sick, changing water into wine. He's not a newbie to this miracle thing. And remember, the disciples were right there with him during all of this. But Philip forgets all the miracles and starts to panic. I don't know, there's too many people, it's going to cost a fortune. He's given all sorts of excuses why this cannot happen. There's no way, Philip says, we can feed all these people. How do you expect us to do it? And even if we tried and succeeded, there'll only be a bite, just one bite. How often do you and I walk around surrounded by blessings and miracles, and then when we face a challenge, we give up, or we give in, or we feel overwhelmed, or we feel like God has left us, as if we're alone and we're defeated? How many? For my first church, it was all the time, all the time. So Andrew sees a small way out of the problem. There's a boy, and this boy has enough fish and bread for at least Jesus and the disciples to eat, not enough for everybody else. And then comes the other lesson. Jesus takes an ordinary boy and ordinary food, and he does something extraordinary. A boy, 5 small loaves, 2 fish, and God means that 5,000 people can be fed. Our God has a history of using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Moses, a murderer, becomes a deliverer of God's people from Egypt. David, a shepherd, becomes Israel's first king. Jesus, a boy from Nazareth in the backwater of nowhere, Galilee, is the Messiah of God. Folks, that's our God. Just imagine what God can do with you if you let him. And inside you're saying, I don't know enough about the Bible, I'm not holy enough, I don't go to church enough. But you know what? God doesn't care about our excuses. All he cares about is what we do with the miracle that he gives our lives. How he can use us to change this world if we let him. So what happens? Jesus has the disciples sit the people down. In the gospel, it says they set them down in groups, and then Jesus shows them how this God thing works. And the first thing he does is he stops. Stops. Remember that in your crazy, frenetic, busy lives. Sometimes we are so busy and so rushed and so on the move that we miss God. Sometimes we are so busy and so rushed that we take God for granted. Sometimes we are so busy and so rushed that we take everything and everyone in our lives for granted. And so he stops and he looks at the people, maybe 5,000, maybe more. Each one of these people is loved by God and looks at the gifts, the 5 small loaves and the 2 fish, and then he trusts. He gives thanks to God. He says, Lord, thank you for all these people, my friends, for what little they have, and for what we're going to have to share with each other, hoping and trusting that together with you at the center, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Then he starts to distribute it, and a miracle happens. Because not only is it just a bite, it's more than enough. It's over the top, which is everything with Jesus. But that's what happens when God's love is with real faith in real life. It's interesting, there's a theory with some biblical scholars that say that Jesus actually didn't miraculously make food appear out of nothing. Most people in Jesus' day never traveled without food and water, right? They kept it together. And the thought that was that maybe all the people were hiding their food because they were afraid to show their blessing because they'd have to share it with somebody else. They were afraid to share. And they didn't believe what God could do when a community of 5,000 who loved God could do together. And what could their tiny amount of food do to feed the 5,000 until they see this boy, this simple boy who shared with the rabbi all he had. And then the rabbi started to share it with everybody else. And suddenly food appeared out of nowhere, and the food was shared. In fact, so much was shared, it filled baskets. Now, that's just a theory. And some people don't like the idea that Jesus didn't miraculously create food, but that people shared it. People in my first church hated that idea. But let me ask you this. Is it more miraculous for Jesus to manifest something out of nothing, or is the miracle that Jesus taught greedy, insecure, fearful human beings like us, ordinary people, that together we can do extraordinary things? We can be miracles for each other. And not only a little miracle, but we can be a huge, huge blessing overflowing miracle. Which one's more miraculous? What says more about real faith for real life? When was the last time that you saw somebody manifest food out of nothing? Compared to the last time someone trusted God in an impossible situation and a community of faith rallied to make it happen. And not only did it happen, but it was more than they ever dreamed of. Well, my first church, that experience was 24 years ago. And I had to finally find a church that I could fall in love with. And that's this church. That's us together. This church and the church before it has restored my faith in what a vibrant, crazy for God church can be like. When COVID hit this a few years ago, right, we had this crazy idea that we could remodel and rebuild a church. And people said we were nuts. We couldn't get enough money. We couldn't get enough people to help. And we did it. After COVID, everybody else said the church is dead and all the churches around us are dying. And guess what? We didn't believe them. And every Sunday, new people come to discover what we all love so much. Last year, we had 100 people join this church. When our teams asked this church to grow giving this last year by 9%, because we have a lot more to do in this world, all my pastor's friends that I told what we were doing said I was crazy. They said that their hope for next year was to not lose more than $20,000. This year, this church stood up and gave 9% so that more people could find the amazing gift we found. When pastors and churches say their churches are getting older and nobody wants to come to church anymore, church is a thing of the past, well, we're getting younger. Junior sermons, have you seen this craziness that's going on up here? Right? It's awesome. Melts my heart every time. In fact, just a quick aside. When Pastor Barrick first started the children's sermon, right, this church had never had that before, ever. So he had the kids come up front. And about 2 weeks after he started it, someone wrote him a letter and said that he was going to hell, that this was a thing of Satan. See the difference, right? What blows me away is the large number of kids who were here when I first came 26 years ago, that were in my youth group and my first communion classes and my confirmation classes, who have lived through all of my crazy ideas, surrounded by all of you people. And they love this place so much. There's some of them here. They bring their kids to this place to learn about the power of God's love. And they're sitting there with their grandparents too. This is a special place, folks. Last thing this morning, I usually give you some spiritual work for the week. Like look for God in the ordinary places of your life, or be the boy and unleash your miracles with love. But I'm not going to give you those. See how I did that? I'm not going to give you those. I just want to thank you for being the church. Being the people of God who live real faith for real life every single day. Thank you for your love for this place, for believing that God is doing amazing things here. Thank you for welcoming people into our family, people that no one else would welcome. And yes, you don't know this, but there are several ex-prostitutes that come to church at this place, and they feel loved. Thank you for giving and volunteering and reaching out and reaching in to all those in need. And thank you, my dear church family, for showing the world that real faith for real life is possible, because it's happening this day and forevermore. Amen. Please pray with me. Gracious and holy God, we thank you for giving us this incredible miracle of being together as community. And we all don't know each other all the time, and we're all connected in different ways, but we come together, and Lord, you make amazing things happen for us. Continue to allow us to be innovative. Continue to allow us to be excited about what the future holds, to not listen to all the voices. Allow us to love each other and care for each other and support each other each and every day. And allow this place to be a place that anyone can come to feel loved and accepted. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Please rise.